Thank you, everybody, for joining us for this episode of the MyCom Church Marketing Podcast. My name is Dan Wunderlich. I'm a United Methodist pastor, and today we're bringing you the next installment of our occasional feature called How We Work. On these special episodes, we feature interviews with real-life United Methodists digging into the practical details of how they do the work of church marketing and communications. On all of our previous How We Work episodes, we've spoken with people who have the dedicated job of church marketing or communications. But I know many of you in our audience are pastors who are doing the work yourself in addition to your pastoral duties. And even for those of us who have help either in the form of paid staff or volunteers, the pastor can play an integral role in this important work. And so today it is my pleasure to welcome a good friend of mine and our first pastor to the How We Work series, Reverend Sarah Heath. Sarah is the lead pastor of First United Methodist Church of Costa Mesa in Costa Mesa, California. Sarah, thanks so much for being with us today.
Oh, I'm so glad to join you guys. And I'm a real life Methodist. I love that you say that, real live Methodist. It's true.
Yes, absolutely. Well, Sarah, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your church, and the context of your ministry?
Yeah, sure. So I am in Costa Mesa, California, and it is a kind of a beach town. It's in some ways, it's right by Newport Beach. Perhaps you've heard of it. Or the other one, Laguna Beach, is
Oh,
another
yeah.
one that we are well known for. I have been at this site now for, it's been whew, almost 4 years. So July started my fourth year. We were a church that was founded in 1912. The building's built in 1927, and up until 2016, they were worshiping about 17 to 27 folks when I got there.
Mm.
And those are mostly elderly folks. But they did, good news, friends, have a full bell choir and a full choir. So you can imagine the moment in worship when 8 of those humans stood up from where they were and went, went up on the stage. So it was a really awkward moment, but that's what they
Yeah.
did. And they're
Yeah.
incredible people, but they just couldn't figure out how to minister to their folks. And so it kind of became one of these things where, all right, like, what are we going to do? Are we going to shut the doors? Are we going to just do something completely different? Are we going to sell this beautiful building? It's this really iconic building in the heart of Costa Mesa, and it kind of fallen into disrepair, and they had to tear down all of their classroom spaces to make room for parking, because there'd been sort of like this handshake agreement that they would always be able to use a parking lot. And guess what? When space in California is often needed for housing,
Yep.
that area got sold. And then folks were trying to figure out, okay, where do we park? So for a church that could seat around, 300, you were having about 11 parking spots. So 200,
Mm.
I guess it seats around 200, because they had taken out also a lot of their seating in the balcony to make room for a very, very, very large organ, which actually was too big for the space, which is a whole nother podcast. But
Yeah,
uh,
absolutely.
so yeah, it has been a really interesting season and trying to figure out, okay, like, what are we going to be about? Who are we? And the area itself is a very interesting area where if if you go east, it's predominantly folks who are like, literally the church is in the midst of what's the busiest intersection of all of Orange County. And so if you go east from that intersection, you're in the Newport area, you're in upwardly mobile, millennial, very hipster kind of coffee shop area. If you go west, it's a area that's largely immigrant. So it's a
Mm.
very interesting. The church is almost right on the middle of both of those things. So imagine that, and the demographic of a super expensive area. And this church has been doing amazing work. They had been feeding lots of folks in a soup kitchen kind of environment. They had 700 people coming in every week for AA affiliated and other addiction affiliated groups. However, those groups, you're not allowed to bring folks from that. You can't advertise specifically to those groups. So it became a really interesting thing where they were a very busy campus, but only 17 people in worship on Sundays.
Mm.
And they,
Hmm.
because of the way that our system was running, they had all the committees, everything you can imagine, with 17 to 27 folks trying to do that.
Wow.
Yeah. So I came in 2016. They had torn all of their buildings except for the sanctuary down. They had sold their parsonage and they were building a parking lot. They paved Paradise, put up a parking lot. And it was one of those things
Yeah.
where I was asked to sort of grow slow and try to figure out leadership. And that wasn't something that happened. We just grew really fast. Not huge, really fast, but we grew. The first Sunday I was there were 55 people. And at the
Oh,
time we
wow.
had zero power. And I don't mean that like figuratively. I mean, literally, someone had stolen all of our copper wire. And so my first Sunday, they had been worshiping in the lobby for, I think, about a month, maybe 2 months, because they had no power. And so that was where it was brightest, they thought. But there was a broken stained glass window that someone had thrown a brick through, thinking the church was basically that no one was there, that it was abandoned. So it's this really painful place where we've been growing over the last 3, almost 4 years. And it's also been a really difficult, yeah, a lot of my work is grief work almost with the folks who stayed around, and then also kind of rebranding ourselves to the community because the community knew the church. But I mean, at my first year, the number of people who asked me, "Oh, that church is still open?"
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's kind of a little bit of our demographic. We're super diverse, actually, in the church building itself. And so, one of the things I love is that all 6 living generations are there. We're not
Oh,
we're
wow.
not huge. We probably worship, 75 to 80 right now on a Sunday, but we have a lot of people who sort of would consider this their church, but they might only go once every other month. So it's just a very
Hmm.
different culture here in California where folks are very busy. Sunday is for sure not a down day. There are lots of
Right.
things that happen. And so, yeah, it's a very different culture, but I would argue that it's almost sort of the way that all of America is kind of moving. A lot of things start here. So,
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Part of your story reminds me of that old adage about evangelism and visibility of your church. The question, if your church closed, would anyone notice?
right.
Like,
Yeah.
it's kind of funny to think people think your church already closed. So,
Yeah, I mean, the number of real estate people who called me and was like, "Is that building available?" I was like, "No, no, we're still here. Yeah, we just have
yeah.
brick, boarded up." And so the fun part is I have done a lot of restoration, not just of community, but the actual building, which is like a unique skill that I don't think I always quite understood that I had. So restoring everything from really getting immersed in understanding like what our architecture would have originally looked like because the entire community around the church is one of the oldest buildings in the city. So most of the buildings were built to sort of mirror the church itself. So it has this sort of mission, they call it mission architecture. And so it's been really fun to repaint the outside of the building and make it really kind of back to its original beauty because it has this huge bell tower that's so recognizable. And I call it an iconic building because you see pictures of it everywhere around the cities. It's just a really well known building, but it had looked, honestly, it was starting to look like it was closed and like it was going to be turned into a museum. And there were all kinds of fun rumors about what the church was going to turn into. And so I think we shocked everyone when we were still a church.
Well, that was the one of the things that instigated me to invite you on to the program is that I have followed you on social media for the last couple years, and you're almost doing this sort of like fixer upper type
Yeah,
behind the scenes work of. I think the week that we're recording, you just turned a door into a
I did.
bench, and you've been redoing floors and turning old rooms that used to hold other things into coffee bars and things like that. And I know myself, I have thought of things like renovations or building projects as an inconvenience and almost like, oh my gosh, we can't post anything on social media till we're done. This is going to hold everything up. But you've turned this process into an opportunity to connect with your community in person and to share about
Yeah.
the message of renovation. So can you talk a little bit about how you've used this not as an inconvenience, but actually as a vehicle for marketing your church and connecting with people
Sure,
online?
absolutely. So we have the weird discovery that kind of folks love a good before and after, don't they? Like
Oh, yeah.
folks love and we the marketing is really fascinating. Actually, if you look at some of the marketing and reviewing that looks at the last couple of years, one of the biggest shows that's watched. So I think one of our big problems in America right now is bipartisanship. So we're kind of in our own
Mm,
silos and Zuckerberg decide who we talk to. Our algorithms are kind of who we hang
yeah.
out with. And I think the church has this super unique place. I think the question a lot of humans are asking is why go to church? Why put myself in community? What is that about? And I think for a lot of people, what they don't realize is it offers them an opportunity to be around people who are different than them, because most of the things that we do can really allow us to remain in our algorithm. And so church is this unique space where you can hang out with people that are different than you. And what's interesting is I think that there is a longing for that. And I think markets tell us that because we look at one of the number one watch shows, however you feel about it, is Queer Eye. Both
Right.
conservative and progressive folks watch the show Queer Eye. Why is that? I think part of it is because they're doing this beautiful work and I would consider Kingdom of God work. In fact, I joke around that it is the best sermons you'll ever hear. And you're seeing people transform, but their space isn't just transforming. Their person outside isn't just transforming, but they're encountering another. And I think the realization for me is that I have done this work since I started ministry, and not just
Mm.
with buildings. Every ministry space I've ever been in, I find myself moving the furniture. I find myself updating a wall. I find myself really trying to use what is already present, but make it in a way where the story isn't done and people can participate. And I didn't really have a language for that until I was meeting with friends of mine who are actually marketers. And we were talking about some of the side projects I do. And they were like, if we could just sum up all your work into one sentence, what would it be? And I realized that that sentence really was that I make space for people. So I make space
Mm.
for people who, my congregation is predominantly none and done folks, or a lot of them are bored or burnt, is another word I heard recently.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and really, what I try to do is make space for them when they thought there wasn't space. And the same is true for the building restoration stuff. And people are so fascinated by that. And what's really interesting is the community ownership that's happened for us. As the outside of our building has changed, people have realized so has the inside. And so many people would say in our first, like, we have these welcome desserts where we get to know new people. They would say, I've driven by this church since I was a kid, and I always thought it wasn't for me. And then maybe I found it on social media or I heard Sarah on a podcast. The way people find church is so different than it used to be, especially if your church building is known in the community. So little things like
Right.
us updating the landscaping, which was absolutely needed and done through a community partnership, really has changed the ethos of the community itself. And what we find interesting is that all the buildings around us have started to also transform. It's like the church, which is like, think about that theologically, that the church kind of went through this transformation, and buildings around it are also starting to sort of change to the color scheme, even. There's this sort of like interesting thing where the church is changing the culture, and I
Mm.
don't ever want to say there's a separation, because I really think that there is not a separation between sacred and secular. I really don't. I think kind of what we are in the community is sort of a reminder of what people already are. And I see this ownership happening, and I hear people, we've had a lot of events lately, and the mayor has come to all of them, the mayor for our city. And she has once, several times said, now you have to remember, I'm in a city where there are a lot of very big mega churches, but she keeps calling this church, this church is the community church, and it has been since 1912. And so even some folks who
Wow.
don't go to that church tithe. Even some folks who don't maybe show up on Sundays would say, oh, that's our church. So it's this really interesting thing where showing the like vamping renovation really for me has been helping to narrate the story is not done. I think a lot of churches, when we walk into them, their buildings feel as though the story has already been told. And
Mm.
it's like your
Mhm.
grandma's house and you can't touch anything. And while it might be
Yeah.
lovely, it doesn't resonate with me. And what's really interesting is we look at the studies as well. Millennials and those who are younger, we still haven't quite named them, right? We're calling them boomlets or Generation Z. They say, I want a church that looks like a church. If I'm going to go into a sacred space, I want it to look like a sacred space, but I don't want it to feel unapproachable. I don't want it to feel like a museum. And so it's this really interesting thing. We can tell this, right? Because in my area, a lot of old churches have been turned into like pubs, coffee
Yeah.
shops. It's sort of this
Right.
reclaiming of the space for the community, because for a while it only belonged to those who were inside. And we're
Mm.
sort of
Mhm.
like opening the doors. So as you see me like redo the space, when I'm trying to say, really not just to our community, but to the community outside, is we're revamping our space to say that this isn't our space, this is our space, this is community space. And so, we
Mm,
did
mhm.
I know that you and I were going to get into it, but we did this thing called Costa Makers, which is a Maker's Mart and art gallery. And basically, this beautiful 1927 building, we turned the sanctuary into an art gallery. And kids from Ray Elementary, one of the lower income schools in the city, even though the teachers are incredible and the parents are incredible, but they're working two jobs just to be able to make ends meet in some ways. So these kids, their art was hanging on the wall next to some, incredible artists. Even like the one of the former
Yeah.
singers of the band Korn had his artwork up.
Yeah.
These amazing artists. And what it really is saying is like, this is your church, whether you go here or not. And our hope is really that this building doesn't turn into a museum or, one of the things that breaks my heart more than anything is going into a Methodist church. And the first thing they tell you is how big they used to be.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's kind of like opening the doors to that was sort of like inviting people into the transformation. And we've actually had people visit because they've seen me either do furniture design. So, what you were referring to is I took when the sort of in the grief process, one of the things we had to do is change the doors. Well, all the doors were original to the building, but they really weren't remaining locked and they were kind of falling apart. And people thought I was crazy, but I was like, save those doors. And what I did with one door is I turned it into a barn door for my own laundry room in a condo that I own. And then the other ones, I just kept thinking they have to be something. And so, as we've been sort of talking to our community, the realization is a lot of the folks in our community are what's known as deconstructed. So, they have evaluated their faith and they're sort of taking apart the pieces. And so, what I decided is for a 6-week series, I would deconstruct these doors. And the doors really became a metaphor for what are the things that brought you into faith, right? So, maybe it was fear. Maybe you were afraid of hell. Maybe it was a good thing. Maybe a friend brought you in, but you're not, that relationship isn't what's maintaining the faith. Maybe you had this understanding of Jesus that you don't have anymore. And so we had this whole sort of series called Reformation, like deconstruction to building something new. And so with Reformation, the idea is it's reformation. It's not getting rid of, because I think for our older folks, a lot of the fear was like, if something new is built, it means what was old is destroyed. And what's
Right.
interesting from TV shows on HGTV or whatever, they never destroy the thing, do they? They always repurpose and reform. And I think that's a theological gift that we've been given where we are invited to co create. And so we took these doors and, we did this fun thing like 4 weeks in. I said, one of the things that we have to do is, who do you say that I am? It's time for us to say who Jesus is to us, who this story, like, what does this story have to say to us now? And I love that because Jesus's followers who walked with him for so long, they still had to answer a question, who do you say that I am? And it's like, dude, we've been hanging out with you for so long. How are you asking that?
Yeah.
Of course I know
Yeah.
your name. Like, say my name. But he's really asking them, like, what am I to you? And I think we
Yeah.
think in faith communities in like in modern times, is that right now this moment that we make this profession of faith, that's the only time we have to define who Jesus is. And I just don't think that's true. I think there has to be a reformation. Or it's kind of like if you're bored with someone, you don't ask any more questions. Well, if you've just decided who Jesus is in that moment and that's enough, you're done. So we had this whole Sunday where I was like, okay, like tell me who you think Jesus is, and then the question turned to the, if that's too deep of a question, let's look at these doors. What do you think these doors could be? And the whole time I was planning to turn them into a bench and a communion table. Because one of the things that I find really difficult about deconstruction is that folks deconstruct and then it just goes into an inward focus, which actually leads to depression and all kinds of things. However, if we deconstruct with the intention and outcome of being present to the other, like people around us, it's this beautiful moment of having a meal or sitting on the bench with someone else who's gone through deconstruction. So yeah, these it was
Mm.
reclaiming, and it's also saying to folks who are from the older, like more, I hate to use the word legacy, but the folks who were there before, that what's happening is we have not destroyed the doors. We're just using them in a different way. We have not destroyed the rooms that we no longer have organ parts in, but have turned them into something else. because we want it to be a constant story that's being written by those who are there. And just in the way that you wrote it, people who come along are writing it. And guess what? Your story is not done. So, yeah, I just have this huge passion for sharing that story. And what's interesting is the number of people who have engaged me in that process. I mean, it's almost unbelievable around the country, people who follow me on social media or follow our church who will reach out and say, like, whoa, I haven't thought of my space in that way. Or I'm not a person of
Yeah.
faith, but wow, that sounds like something I'd want to participate in. Can I buy that bench? People have asked that. Yeah. So it's this really interesting thing where I'm getting to do what I'm passionate about and maybe was something that I thought was separate from my theology, but is absolutely, I realize what I've always been doing is making space for other people. And so to tell that story is sort of the marketing piece because you're just telling the truth of who you are. And people really,
Mhm.
man, they light up. It's an interesting dynamic for sure.
Well, and this is just such an excellent example of a type of church marketing that doesn't have to revolve around come to our building on this date at this time for this specific event. You are taking literally the life of your church and you are sharing it with the community. You are bringing the community into the process. You are not saying, we have created an excellent experience that is all
Uh-uh.
finished and we're ready for you to come watch it. And so I think so often we feel like our media is either
Right.
completely disconnected, our marketing is completely disconnected, we're just grabbing images from free websites or from the place where we've subscribed to, it puts a Bible verse over the picture of the Alps, even though your church
Right.
is in Oklahoma. And
Yes.
um but then here you're truly using the in process life of your church to market your church, which in so many ways is genius is a strong word, but I'll use it here because I can't think of anything else so quickly. Because when they show up, what they are going to experience is the in process life
Oh,
of your church.
absolutely. And I think they have been watching it from the outside, right? They have been seeing it as they drive by. The way this church has changed is so hard to describe. And I think that people have been watching it and we do the big events that get people on campus. But I also
Right.
think that one of the interesting and fun parts is the day to day sharing that part of the story and saying, like, hey, like, this is not finished and we need you in this process. This building is being transformed, not so that it can be a beautiful museum where people can come and look, but something that people can participate in, touch, be part of. We've taken the plastic off of grandma's couch. Now let's come look at it. And there is such a for us here in California, if something's from 1980, it's antique, and so to have people
Right.
be able to engage with something from the 1920s, it also brings out pride in the folks that have been there for a while to really say, because their biggest fear, right, is someone's going to come in and say your stuff is awful and we hate it. I'm not sure if it was the lead that you were at a conference that you and I met at, but there was a conference and I was really like, and they say at the beginning, like, sometimes people are going to say things that are going to bother you. And that's a gift as well. Like, so process that and think through that. And somebody
Right.
shared that you got to get rid of the choir robes. You got to get rid of choirs. Got to, da. And I was like, I actually
Mm,
don't think that's necessarily always the case. And what bothered me as I processed it later, like, why did their thing bother me? And it wasn't just that it came from what felt like such a stance of like superiority, like almost like the idea like we're the new, let's get rid of the old. Because I
right.
wanted to say like the new is new, like now is new and now is new and now is new. So you can't chase new. And
Right.
so what I realized is that my parents were in the back of my head the whole time, who are
Mm,
dedicated choir members at their church, who are givers, not just of finances, but of time. And you're telling me that they're no longer valuable to your community when you throw out the choir
mm.
robes with no thought as to why and no processing with your community as to why. Now, I'm sure that your church is super cool and that's great, but I don't want to have any more communities that are solely based on affinity because, like I said, I think that's how we got into this bipartisan mess. And so we're really careful to market stuff to all kinds of different age groups. We don't just want the like young, upward mobile hipster that happens to be big in this area. There's a lot of churches doing young, hipster, upwardly mobile ministry that's big here. That's not something we can really compete in, and we shouldn't, right? But
Right.
but we can do
Right.
us. And what we've found is so many people long to have a real relationship with someone who's older than them and someone who's younger than them. And so we try to, even in our photos that we post and the things that we do, to really show like this is like a mess. This community is is it looks like the kingdom of God, which means you're going to have like all kinds of diverse people, and it's not always tidy. It can be like kind of a mess as far as like, people say things during prayer requests that you're like, oh, that's awkward. But that's the beauty, because they need a space. And so making space for people, not just physically, are one of the last things that one of the things that we recently did is we put all of the pews on casters.
Oh,
So
okay.
that Sunday when I revealed, so this is like, imagine like your in place made 1927 hand carved pews, which are great until you only have one room. And one of the things people
Right.
kept saying to me is, if you're going to utilize the space, you got to have chairs, 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 chairs. And I was like, here's the deal though. All I can think about is, if you've ever seen the movie Fight Club, how many
Yep.
places do we get our own chair, our little
Mm.
individualized chair? The gift of a pew is I have to like move by you, I have to sit near you. And if I don't know you, that's awkward. So it forces me into knowing the person on my pew. And so I didn't want to get rid of pews. Also, weddings love a pew. So instead, what we decided to do is put them on casters so they wheel and lock in place. And so we can do fun things like where for Advent, we're going to have yoga in that space because it's beautiful. And because we can move
Mhm.
things all around. And that final sermon, when I revealed the table and the pew, or I mean, and the bench, is that I had the pews face each other. So they're in a circle looking at each other. And basically, what I was hoping to say is like, guys, if we're going to build community, it can't be around the person at the front, because guess what? You can hear better sermons any Sunday, but it should be about being able to
Yeah.
face and be with the other, because that's the divine spark. So, yeah, I don't know if that answers the marketing piece, but yeah, we're just we share what's on the inside, hoping that people want to participate in it. And that's always kind of our goal.
Well, let me ask, you have had an evolution on how the church marketing and social media and things have
Yeah.
been done since you got there. I would imagine when you arrived, you didn't have a social media staff member in your 12 to 27 people. And so share with us what it was like to start the process yourself, and how it's grown, and what you all have done since
Well, we
then.
had a Rolodex, so we had that. I was co-working at a
Yeah.
really cool co-working space, and I brought them the Rolodex, and I said, "All right, 20 somethings, what is this?" And they're like, "We have no idea." And so we kind of started at the bottom, but the pastor before me had a Facebook, so they had a Facebook. I did a lot of the posting at first, and it very quickly became that was just going to be insane. So we had a community
Mm.
member who at first was volunteering, and then we were able to write a grant and get her on for a couple of hours a week. And then it actually became too much for her because she got promoted at her very cool marketing job. So what we had was a guy in our church who himself had been a he'd been a megachurch pastor and megachurch planter. He had planted one of the biggest churches in our area, got burnt out about 10 years ago and left full-time ministry and went into marketing, and not marketing for churches, marketing for all kinds of things. And he slowly but surely
Interesting.
revealed himself to me. And I brought him on staff to do the marketing piece. He does a really, really great job. And for a while, he was also doing like our community group and stuff like that. But what he discovered is it's really hard in a deconstructed community to do community groups, or anything that feels, yeah, anything that kind of triggers folks in the ways that like they've maybe been hurt in the church before. And so it's been a really interesting process for him to be like, I just want to like do the welcoming piece, the event piece, and the communications piece. And he does it so well because he cares about the community and he cares about getting people there. And so he's one of the most efficient people I know. And he never does anything without asking me, "Hey, what do you think about this?" Or if I have an idea, he's all for it. And so we kind of co-create it. But I have to say, like, his name's David Trotter. He really does create most of what you see out there. Not my personal stuff when it comes to like me building and all that. That's me. But
Right,
yeah, that's
right.
what he does. And he does a great job of it. And it's really nice to have a team member to do that.
And what role do you play in branding or casting the vision? And how is that relationship working for him taking what you all are creating and
Well, that's
then
kind of the
putting it
fun
out
thing.
there?
Even with each series, the start of each series, we meet once a month as a full staff. So all of my staff are bivocational, if not trivocational, because they're all very, very part time. So
Mm,
we meet once a month to talk about
yeah.
vision. And what we talk about is like, what is our next series? And then David will just sort of ask me, okay, image wise, what are you thinking? We think through that and we talk through that. And then also because he did not grow up in maybe as PC an environment, as a megachurch pastor, things are a little bit different. And so being in a community where we really care about the words that we use, the messaging that we're giving, he does such a good job of asking, hey, my inclination is to want to say this. That doesn't really fit, does it? And so then we have great conversations about even like representation and what does it look like to make sure that we see different folks doing different things. And so yeah, I play a big part in it, but I also over the year and a half that we've worked together have really learned to trust his vision for it, which is really nice. We do work on series images together, which again is super fun just because it really helps. So like we're doing a series called For the Bible Tells Me So question mark, kind of engaging like how do we use the scripture.
Mm-hmm.
And he came up with this image that these little
Yeah.
tiny hands holding a little, or these hands that are regular size holding a little tiny Bible. The idea being maybe the Bible is too small if you think it's these things. So he's a
Mm.
really great person to think through those things. And if I'm honest, we just have so much fun thinking through different, we're coming up with language. We give a gift. So our charge conference, the way that we sneakily, if you're Methodist, do charge conferences is that we do what's called a ministry celebration on the same day as our charge conference at the same time. So it becomes
Yeah.
every
Oh,
charge
there you go.
conference thing we have to vote on becomes a celebration for that area in ministry. And we give a gift to all of our volunteers and we try to make it clever and to sort of cast vision even in that. And we like yesterday, we're just spitballing ridiculous, like catchy, cheesy sayings. And for us, that's a lot of fun to think through the marketing of that. So I would say that your marketing person or the person who is going to be doing your branding is one of the first things you need to think through. And I think if I could,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, if I could do a job, I would love to go in and talk about branding and what are you saying just by the way your sign looks, just by the way your building looks. Because branding really is from the ground up. What is your, it's not just what is your font, but it's like, what is the message? What's the central message of your church? So for us, we sat down as a team. Once we hired David to do what we call community cultivating, I know fancy name, but we sat down as a team and as a leadership group and said, "All right, what are we about? Because what are we going to message? We have to know what we're about to message. You can't just have fancy messaging if you don't know what you're messaging." So we came up with the statement that First
Right.
United, and again, we called the church First United. It used to be First United Methodist Church of Costa Mesa, which is really an insular way of saying it. Right? If you're not from that community, like, how do I that's a lot of words. So we just say First United, it's easy to say, and FU is funny. Um,
Yeah.
we didn't mean for that to be the case, but we inherited the name. So First United FU. First United, we sat down and we said, why does First United exist? And what we came to in over a day was obviously, make disciples for the transformation of the world. Great. So I made a sign that says make disciples for the transformation of Costa Mesa, because that's where we're at. And then that
Mm-hmm.
spreads.
Yeah.
But we sat down and what we decided is like what we're all passionate about, what holds us together in that space is that we really exist to tell people that they're already loved by God and that they're invited into radical
Mm.
community to walk the way of Jesus. So that really is an inclusive statement that kind of says like, hey, we're kind of about praxis, not necessarily about, you know, obviously orthodoxy. How do we talk about it? There is a Methodist tradition of that, and we do that. But what's most important for us in this community as we try to figure out how to be community together is how we live together. And so we have this big sign on the sign of our building. The other thing is, it was when you have a 3-story, 4-story bell tower, you can put a giant sign on it and people will notice. So we
Yeah,
put
you
a
can.
2-story sign on the sign of the building, and all it says is, "You're already loved by God." And the number of phone calls we get from people about that is like, what? That's incredible, kind of thing. Or what does that mean? Or, and then when we have events, we put that on the side of the bell tower because it can be seen all over the city. So we're cheating.
That's awesome. Yeah, absolutely. Well, another reason I wanted to have you here is that you have a platform as a speaker and writer. You've got 2 books
Yeah.
out through Abington, which is a part of the United Methodist Publishing House. You also hosted a podcast
Mhm.
for a year, a sort of a limited series podcast. Can you share what you learned from the promotion and marketing of those projects? And also, if there are some of our listeners out there who are pastors who either have sort of a side platform or are
Mm.
interested in doing one. Do you have any tips or words of advice for ways that it can enhance the ministry of the
Heck
church
yes.
without feeling like you're doing it to the detriment of your
Yeah.
local community?
So, wow, I've learned so much. When I started the podcast, so my podcast was called Sonderlust, and it really was the idea of, again, I guess I like to open doors because I opened the door to my life. Um, I am a single
Yeah.
clergy woman, which is so weird. I never wanted to be a pastor. I don't fit a lot of pastor stereotypes, I guess, if those even really exist for women. And so my life has been kind of really disrupted by having this as a job, especially like my dating life and all the things I thought I would have at this point in my life. And so I did a podcast about like, hey, like for a year, I'm just going to really focus on figuring out like what it is that brings me contentment or kind of brings me a sense that I'm where I'm supposed to be. And so I put out a trailer. Don't do this, by the way. I have a really good relationship with my DS, my district superintendent, thankfully. So I put out a trailer where
Yeah.
I said, where I like revealed that for a year I'm going to be really focusing on these things, and that to have skin in the game, my best guy friend, he insists that where I live is really toxic for humans to live in California because it is a
Mm.
very, there are really difficult things about living in this culture. It is very, superficial in some ways, and it's a very transient community, so people live here and then go, and so it's just sort of a different space, particularly if you're like, I kind of have a hipster look, but I definitely love to have super like deep conversations, and that's not necessarily the male situation around this area, needless to say. So
Yeah.
I put out this trailer, and it's like a 2-minute trailer where I talk about, basically I had an incredible editor, and she took all these conversations that we recorded and turned it into this trailer that's basically like, I have all these things that would indicate that my life is successful, but I'm not happy. And he challenged me in all these areas, including my job. And I admitted that I liked my job, but I don't love my job. And for a Methodist who is a church planter to do that, ooh, boy, I got called in
Yeah.
by someone in our leadership who was really uncomfortable with a pastor saying they were unhappy. And the reaction of my leadership board was incredible because the beauty of it for me, and I think everyone needs to do this, is I had a moment where I realized, oh, if I'm not a Methodist pastor, I'm okay. And I feel invited into this work, like, I feel invited into the work of the podcast. I feel invited into this space of like engaging the world. And if that isn't a good fit for what someone thinks of as a local pastor, then I don't need to like fit myself into a local pastor mold. Instead, we can talk about what are the ways that I can transition out. Like, I was really willing to kind of put it on the altar and say, all right, like, I feel like this is where God is kind of inviting me, and I totally should have cleared it with you. And it's funny, my DS was like, I'm not mad about it. I just wish I had known so that when I heard this in a meeting, I could have said, no, this is a plan. What's been interesting is we've had people join our church because of it. And the people on my leadership
Yeah.
team, several
Yeah.
of them said it's Sarah's authenticity and willing to let things not be perfect that have us here. It's Sarah going out and doing events that have brought a lot of our big leaders because she's met someone they know or that kind of stuff. So out of that, the agreement was that I would do outside work as well, that I would continue to speak and write. I haven't had as much time as a church planner. It's so much work. I think I have burnt the candle at both ends a little bit too much, and I think that's
Mm.
something that's
Mhm.
coming to a head currently. But I made a deal with my church. I said, "All right, I will once a month is the most that I will speak at an outside event, and that I will make that part and understand that as part of my ministry. And the church needs to buy in for you." The advice I would give is have buy in from your leaders. Say, hey, like, I feel like I want to open the doors. Too often as pastors, we like sit in the boat and we try to tell the fish why the boat is such a good boat, like marketing, like, you guys, we've got the best, whatever. Instead of like getting out, fish don't jump in a boat. They just don't. So you have to get out
Right.
there.
Right.
And for me, that looked like being on a more global stage. And it's been really fascinating the number of people it's reached. And I think that's really my calling there. And it's not, I realized too, it wasn't out of ego. It was really out of like feeling a sense that I don't have a space. And so, what does it look like to really allow myself to be human? Because we put people on pedestals so much. So, my tip would be tell your DS. My other tip would
Yep. Yep.
be that you like kind of speak at as much stuff as you can if you get invited into those spaces, because the skill we have of writing sermons really is a skill that can help so many people in so many different areas. So like I help teach a group of people who are entrepreneurial learn how to tell their story because it's a gift. We don't realize because we do it all the time that the ability to like communicate well is not something everybody has, and not everyone knows why they do what they do. And so, if you help them, using business models like Simon Sinek, using all these kind of ideas of like how can we be authentic leaders really captivates people. And what's
Right.
interesting is often they will come then to your community, but it is a kind of it's a different model of ministry from what the old school thing was, and it requires that you have people in your I've got people in my community who are former pastors. So I'll be in Hawaii next weekend preaching. I'm suffering for the Lord. um, I'm doing an event
Yes.
for a Hawaiian community, and it means that one of my leaders has to preach. But I actually think that's good for the church because it doesn't need to revolve around me. The other thing I would say is that our denomination has for so long made pastors feel like they're replaceable. So anyone should be able to go anywhere, right? That's kind of what we're told as elders anyway. But the truth is that's not
Right.
true. It really isn't. And we've only damaged people by having, if you go to, we've actually, you and I have talked about how fit is so important. And it's important for your community as well
Right.
as for you and your mental health. And I would say that being you is one of the most beautiful gifts that you give a community. And so don't squelch that, don't shrink that, and really have that conversation with your leaders to say, like, look, part of what I do is this, and I think it's going to draw people toward me. And when you get attacked, because you will, because it doesn't look like the model of the pastor is all things to all people in a very local, specific place, what
Right.
you say, because one of the things that people said to
Right.
me was, people really like you. And I was like, oh, but it wasn't nice. It was like, people really like you, and that's a problem.
Right.
And I was accused of having a cult of
Mm.
personality and all this sort of stuff. And I was like, oh, it felt so shaming. And then I had a dear friend who actually does public theology, and has a very popular podcast. He said to me, Sarah, people followed Jesus because they liked him. It's okay.
Yep.
As long as you're not,
Exactly.
like, letting it get to your head of like and he's like, "And you're not, because we would tell you if you were." So have people that will, like, call you out if that's a thing. But I think, like, as much as you can get the message out there, it doesn't matter what form it is. And by the way, just to wrap it up, it's the most Wesleyan thing you can do. Dude stood on a rock and yelled to
Absolutely.
communities outside when
Yep.
everyone says you have to do it inside a church.
Yes.
Oh my
Well,
gosh.
Sarah, thank you so much for all that you have given to us today and all that you've shared with us. If there are folks out there that want to follow your work or reach out and say hi or ask
Oh my gosh, it's
questions,
the
what's the
easiest
best
thing
way for
ever.
them
So
to do that?
Rev Sarah Heath, and there are so many H's in that because I am a Sarah with an H, HATH, and not believe it or not, you will if you look on Amazon for Sarah Heath, you're gonna want to put the Rev in there, well, or just like put Sarah Heath and the names of my book, which are What's Your Story and the Authenticity Challenge, because otherwise there is an incredible woman named Sarah Heath who is the world's most renowned cat psychologist. So if you're looking for that, you
Okay.
can find
All
her
right.
there.
All right. That
Not
is
my
not
jam.
your
Not my
side
side hustle.
platform.
Nope.
Awesome. Well, Sarah, thank you so much for being here today. Well, now, listeners, we've gotten the ball rolling on this series once again, and we want your help in spotlighting some of the ministries in our denomination that are making a difference in their communities through marketing and communications. Who do you want to hear from, and what should we ask them? Email us at podcast@umcom.org, and you can, of course, use that email, podcast@umcom.org, to send us any feedback or topic suggestions you have for the show. We always love hearing from you. Finally, if you found this podcast to be helpful and you'd like to make sure that other church communicators like yourself find this resource, the two biggest things you can do are share this episode with your friends and colleagues, or leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Google Play Music, or whatever service you're listening to us on right now. Thanks again for listening to the MyCom Church Marketing Podcast.